Welcome, everyone. I see people are still coming in into the meeting, so just am going to stall a little bit. My name is Randy Silverman, which I'll probably repeat as I see more people coming in. But we are so excited to have this webinar today. It's been a while. We had a whole series of parenting in the pandemic webinars when COVID first started. And this is our first after taking several months off. We're really excited to have everyone back. We had a tremendous response in terms of how many people RSVP'd and are interested in speaking with us. And I think that has a lot to do with our wonderful guest today, who we are thrilled to have. So it looks like people are still pouring in from the waiting room. I'm just going to give it a little bit more time. It is a beautiful sunny day here. I'm actually calling in from Connecticut, and I'm excited to have Elizabeth Errico here. She's calling in from glorious Hawaii, which I'm sure is a lot sunnier, as you can see by the beautiful backdrop there, Elizabeth. Hawaii must be really beautiful right now.
It is.
Good morning. Yes, people are starting to say good morning. Please say hello in the chat. Maybe I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping, which is, please feel free to use the chat. If you at any given point want to ask some questions, I'll be monitoring the questions and I'll pass them over to Elizabeth throughout our conversation. And if you want to raise your hand, ask a question, of course, feel free to just ask the question. I think, is it just to panelists or panelists and attendees? It's hard for me to see. Sorry. All right. Well, just want to say hello from West Virginia. I see someone from West Virginia. Thank you all for joining us today. All right, I think that's about as much stalling as I can do right now. So, except for somebody raised their hand, I guess that means that the hand is being raised. That I'm not exactly sure, but nice to have you from New York City, from West Virginia, Dutchess County, New York. Hello, everyone. We're really happy to have you. Don't feel that some from California, from Connecticut, Kentucky, all over the country. That's fantastic. Well, welcome. My name is Randy Silverman. For those of you who don't know me, I am the founder and executive director of the Youth Mental Health Project. And this topic that we're going to be talking about today with Elizabeth Errico, who is the executive director of the Juvenile Bipolar Research Foundation, is actually the basis of why I started the Youth Mental Health Project. I am, for those of you who don't know, a mother. I have 3 sons. And when my middle son was very young, he struggled significantly with anxiety and depression. And by the time he was 11 years old, he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Our struggle and journey was very complicated. I was very isolated. We were isolated as a family. It took us a long time to find resources, a very long time. And there were many doctors who insisted that our son could not have bipolar disorder, not believing that bipolar disorder could actually happen in children. So I'm thrilled to have this conversation today with Elizabeth. Elizabeth Errico is a mental health professional, and she has practiced psychotherapy for many years. She has a child, and in addition to being the executive director of the Juvenile Bipolar Research Foundation, she is, like me, a mother of a child who has struggled. To me, that's the most important qualification, because I believe that parents know their children best. I've said this before for those of you who've tuned into other webinars. We have a gut sense sometimes that there's something going on with our child, but it's the finding resources and trying to understand what's happening that's so complicated, and it leaves us feeling very isolated and alone. So I'm thrilled to be able to share more information with all of you today about and really dive into this topic. I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Errico. Elizabeth, it's so nice to have you. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Randy. I'm really excited to be here.
So I guess we just dive right in, right?
Sure.
I'd love you to, I'm sure you'll weave in a little bit about your personal journey. Of course, feel free to share whatever bits of that feel comfortable for you. I think we just want to start off with some, some basic understanding of what is juvenile bipolar disorder? What does that look like? And if you could just give us some basic information for our audience members who maybe don't have experience with this, or who are calling in because they're concerned themselves about someone they might love and know.
That's a great place to start. And I think that part of my personal experience as a mother really factors in here because, as you said, there are a lot of practitioners out there who will tell you that bipolar disorder can't happen in children.
Right.
And as a mental health professional, I was trained that if there's no diagnosis for it in the DSM, then it doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of the prevailing idea that exists in most mental health circles. And so I spent close to a decade knowing in my gut that there was something different about the struggles my son was facing, and that they weren't normal childhood struggles, that there was more to it. And I was repeatedly pushed off by doctors, pediatricians, psychologists, psychiatrists, neurologists, occupational therapists, like you name it. They told me that he was just a boy, or it was just a phase.
You're such fine.
Exactly. Oh, he's so sweet. I don't know what you're talking about.
Exactly right. I got the same thing.
We all do.
Yeah, I got, maybe it's you and you should go seek some help. Did you get that also? We hear that over and over again from families, from parents, that whether it's the teachers or even the psychologists who will say, it's really, you're the problem here.
Yes. And I think that's the most insulting part to families, is that as they are doing everything they can possibly think of to help their child, they're being told that they're the problem. And if they could just discipline better, or if they were better parents, or maybe if they took a parenting class, that somehow it would fix this struggle that their child is having, that most parents recognize isn't coming from their environment. It's coming from something inside of them that they're struggling with. And so that found me as a mental health professional staying up late at night with my DSM, thumbing through it.
Let's take a step back, because
Sure.
Let's assume that people on the call maybe don't know what you mean by DSM. And I don't mean to insult any intelligence, but it took me a lot of years to figure out some of these, the language. So the DSM is what?
It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatric Disorders.
Okay, so it's the big book that doctors use.
I have two of them back there, the gray one, the silver one, and the purple one.
Okay.
That's the 4th edition and the 5th edition. Yeah, they're the Bible, so to speak, of mental health. And
for mental health professionals, right?
Correct. And the dirty little secret that most people don't know is that the DSM was created originally so that mental health professionals could talk to each other using some common language, so that really researchers in New York could talk to researchers in California about what they were studying and have a common vocabulary to use. It was never intended in its original form to be sort of dictatorial in saying that you have to have this in order to have this and whatnot. And that when it was revised in the 1980s into the 3rd edition, it became what insurance companies use to reimburse practitioners.
Right.
So you have to have a code that's in that book to put down on the insurance form in order for the practitioner to get reimbursed, or in the case of out-of-network providers, for the family to get reimbursed.
It's interesting you say that, because when you're talking about diagnoses and labels, and we could have an entire discussion. We could use the whole hour, right? Talking about diagnosis and labels and what they mean and what they don't mean. I try to really reassure parents because the DSM changed, right? There used to be Asperger's, now there's no Asperger's, that it has a lot to do with what services you can get, both through insurance and through school services. And so while in a lot of ways, when you're treating your child, yes, it's helpful to know the diagnosis to give you some guidance. And we'll talk about bipolar disorder specifically and fear of harm. That really the reason you need the diagnosis is much more for insurance companies and for services, right? And to not really get so caught up in the DSM because it's easy to get so blocked by the DSM. And I think what I'm hearing you say that mental health professionals, and you're a mental health professional, are used to looking at this book and checking off a list. And if it doesn't work in the list, then they don't know how to handle it, right? Or they don't know what it is. And so
Yes.
right, that's what we're talking about in terms of bipolar disorder. My experience is that bipolar disorder in children has never really been laid out in the DSM. Is that right?
Correct. I mean, we've had a faulty assumption for a long time that if a disease exists in adults, it will present the same way in children. And so there's this diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and lo and behold, it doesn't present the same way in children. So when a practitioner sees this report from the family and the child and the observations of what the child is struggling with, they go to the DSM and that cluster of symptoms isn't contained. And so they say, well, it can't be bipolar because those aren't the symptoms. But the truth is that it just looks different in kids, even though it's the same diagnosis. And to speak to your point, I always tell parents that it's important to have the right diagnosis so you know what it is that you're facing. But what really matters is that you get the right treatment. It doesn't actually matter what they write down on that form. What matters is what treatment are they providing.
Right.
And that's important.
Right. And that leads to several questions that are already popping up in the chat, which I already thought to ask you. And one is disruptive mood dysregulation disorder,
DMDD,
right? So that did not exist. So when my son was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, the DSM-5 had not been published yet. So there was no DMDD, right? And there was no juvenile bipolar disorder. And the bipolar disorders 1 and 2 that were laid out in the DSM-4 were geared towards adults, so that you had to have these spans of time of depression and these spans of time. And my son didn't have that. He was rapid cycling as a child, which wasn't part of the DSM. And so there was a big backlash about whether he could or couldn't have bipolar disorder. So can we talk a little bit, just while we're digging into just the generic topic of bipolar disorder, what are the differences? Why we understand why it's misdiagnosed quite often. Let's talk about that and talk about, how does it look different in children and adults? Why is there this confusion? And then can we talk a little bit about the DMDD diagnosis, and does that cover it now? Does that, let's dive into the details of that.
So first of all, I'm going to say something a little controversial, which is that the DMDD diagnosis is kind of garbage.
All right,
sorry.
Because I wouldn't have said that because I'm not a mental health professional, but I usually whisper to parents, it's kind of their nice, kind way of saying juvenile bipolar disorder, but the term bipolar disorder scares everyone. So they've just called it something else.
I mean, honestly, that's why they put it in. They put it in so that
it sounds nicer. Disruptive mood dysregulation sounds better than bipolar disorder, right? To me,
yeah, and there's a stigma that goes along with bipolar. But the truth is that most often DMDD is used when the practitioner simply doesn't know what the diagnosis is, but that seems close enough. And so they put that on there. And so if your child has it, but they're getting good treatment that's effective, don't worry about it.
Who cares?
Right. But if you've been given it because nobody really knows what it is, and you're having a bunch of medications that aren't working thrown at you and therapies thrown at you that aren't working, then it is important to know that diagnosis is often just a stopgap measure until they can figure it out.
Or until it gets a little bit older, right?
Yeah.
Symptoms.
And because what they're looking for is they're looking for some evidence of those adult behaviors and symptoms. And so to get to that point of your question, children don't present depression the same way that adults do, and children don't present mania the same way that adults do. And children, while they do present anxiety in similar ways, it still manifests differently around different things. And oftentimes what we see in children with anxiety is an exaggerated fear of something that children were used to them being uncomfortable with. Kids don't like the dark. Kids don't like bugs. Kids are oftentimes afraid of new things. And so we are able to dismiss it as, oh, well, that's just normal in childhood.
I used to be scared of monsters under my bed and eventually you get over it, right?
Right. But in children, it's exaggerated and intensified. In children, depression often appears as irritability, oppositional behavior, rigidity, a disinterest in trying things that are new, being generally sort of cranky and difficult to manage.
Right.
They are not lying in bed sad. They are not having trouble getting up and getting dressed and going out to play with their friends. They're doing all of their normal activities of daily living, and that's tricky.
You said they can. So my son actually had severe school refusal. It was partially anxiety of school, but he would not get out of bed. I mean, he wouldn't get out of bed. But, you know, the next day or that afternoon, he was fine playing soccer. So it felt like he's manipulating, or, you know, a lot of people would say, well, you know, you're just not strict enough, or you have to make him do X, Y, and Z, right? So anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt, but sometimes,
no, and that's true,
but not the whole thing, right? We
think, well, and you've hit the nail on the head in that it's not pervasive throughout the day. It's segmented to specific times. And so that's another piece of how it's different in children, is that children rapid cycle. And so their depressive episodes where they, you know, won't get out of bed or refuse to go engage in some kind of activity is perceived as manipulative, as you said, or oppositional, and they get slapped with oppositional defiant disorder. Right. And the hypomania and mania rapid cycles as well. And that gets mistaken as hyperactivity, and they get slapped with an ADHD diagnosis.
Right. So let's talk about mania, because it took me years to understand. I used to think, because I grew up in the days where it was called manic depression, right? Manic depressive disorder, or whatever it was called. And then it's bipolar disorder. So mania, I used to think was happy. And I thought, my kid's never happy. He's never happy. How could he be manic? You know, the kid was irritable, cranky, difficult, moody, you know, maybe, but not happy. And so describe what some symptoms of mania in children actually, or even hypomania, and describe the difference between those two.
Well, you've described some of those symptoms already.
It just sounds better coming from you.
so the difference between hypomania and mania is really just a matter of intensity. Hypomania is a slightly less intense version. In adults, you're right. The word that is used in the DSM to associate with mania is euphoria. But that's not how it presents in children. They do tend to be irritable, and they tend to become very excitable, very reactive, very focused and determined on doing one thing and one thing only. And if you interrupt them, the sky is falling and they cannot adapt or transition. We call that mission mode.
Oh, it's interesting. It's like a hyper focus, right? The doctors used to say that my son perseverated. Took me a while to figure out what that meant too. But
Yes.
my son would decide, this is a true story. When he was 10 and 9, I think, he decided he wanted to become a falconer. I know it sounds really bizarre, but he loved birds.
Yeah.
And he wanted, that's all he could think about. He wrote a book about falconers. He did all these research about what falcons do and like, and all of this stuff. And it was really interesting because he learned, he could teach himself anything when he was in this tunnel vision. But you couldn't have it, you couldn't distract him from that. I mean,
No.
that's all he could talk about or think about.
Mm-hmm.
And if you tried, all hell would break loose, right? And it was a disaster. I didn't know that was kind of a manic symptom, is what you're describing.
Yes.
He wasn't happy. He wasn't
Right.
euphoric. He wasn't grandiose and thought he could fly. I thought that's what bipolar disorder looks like in mania. But with my son, it was this combination of extreme irritability or perseverating or not being able to transition. So if we had a plan, but things got canceled because someone got sick, that
Disaster.
or the word no, right?
Mm-hmm.
Saying
The
no.
word no is often enough to trigger a defensive and aggressive response to being thwarted. And I think, what you've described is very consistent with what we see over and over again for children. I had one child describe it to me, that when he's in that mode, he feels as though the thoughts that are going through his head are the most important thoughts that anyone has ever had, and they have to get out of his head. He has to say them to someone, or else he's just going to, explode. And so there's it's that pressure within the mind to get those thoughts out, and they're racing usually much faster than they can really truly process them.
Right.
But that episode can last for 45 minutes.
Right.
And then be over.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting some great questions and comments on the chat. First, I do want to let everyone know, yes, this will be recorded on this session, and thanks for asking. We would love you to share it. We will send out links to everyone, and it will live on our YouTube channel. So thanks for asking that. I agree. I love mission mode. Mission mode is a great term instead of perseveration. Sounded so formal, but it was like, yeah, he was on mission mode. And I think these are great explanations of just in general what bipolar disorder or mood disorder, disruptive mood disorder, again, to me, doesn't really matter what the label is, but understanding that it's a mood dysregulation, whether you call it bipolar disorder or disruptive mood dysregulation, it's a mood dysregulation, and it can encompass what can look like typical childhood difficulties, right? Okay, some kids don't like school and they refuse to go to school, or have tantrums over nothing because they don't get their way, right? Or really get hyper into something, or hyperactive. So many parents who come to our support groups whose kids ultimately are diagnosed with bipolar disorder talk a lot about the first diagnosis was ADHD. Right. And do you think that's because they mistake this kind of hypervigilance, or, is that what's going on with that, do you think?
Yeah, they're seeing the rapid cycle hypomania and mania, which involves hyperactivity and not paying attention to authority figures because they're stuck in their own mission in their own mind, and that's misinterpreted as ADHD, hyperactive. Often they get the combined type because they're hyperactive and they're also distracted, because the adults around them are saying they're distracted from what I want them to do. I mean, that's really what the parenthetical at the end of that sentence is.
Right? Yeah.
Right, because they're focused on being a falconer.
And right. Well, I mean, my son taught himself at 11 how to build computers, but he couldn't focus on, addition,
Right.
but he could build a computer. And so people say, well, he can focus on what he wants to focus on. And then they say, well, ADHD is kind of like that, but he didn't have ADHD.
Right.
And his moods and his mind were racing and could shift on a dime. And I always say, I try to say to parents, imagine living with your brain like that, how much work that takes every day for a child. And with my son, it got to the point where he knew he couldn't control it. So he didn't want to go to school because he didn't want to embarrass himself and not be able to hold his brain together while he was at school.
Well, and that touches on another piece of the puzzle, which is stamina. It's exhausting to have a mood disorder.
Yeah.
It is more exhausting to have a mood disorder as a child because in addition to all of the energy your body is taking up growing, you are also having to manage this mood disorder in an environment that you have no control over. Adults are very often able to have some control over their environment. They're able to say no when they're invited to go do something. They're able to say, I need a night in for self-care. They're able to set limits that kids are not given the freedom and the right to do. Mom says, no, it's your cousin's birthday, we're going to the party. And the kid doesn't have the vocabulary to say, but I don't have any stamina left for this.
Yeah, I've used everything up on just getting through, the day, or just, waking up and getting dressed. This is a great question about, let's get back to it, whether there's a huge comorbidity with bipolar disorder and ADHD, especially the combined type. I mean, is it possible to have both, or is it really just confused symptoms? I mean, I get that a lot. And then I have parents whose kids are on medication for both bipolar disorder and ADHD. And in my experience, that tends to be a disaster. So could you speak a little bit to that?
So yes, the medications for ADHD tend to trigger mania and hypomania. And so, it's far from ideal, but given the system that we're stuck with, when kids are diagnosed with ADHD and they go on those meds and it makes things worse, that's a clue that what you're really facing is bipolar disorder.
Yes, it's interesting. That's how my son was diagnosed, actually. He was actually put on an anti-anxiety antidepressant.
An SSRI.
An SSRI. And that triggered his bipolar. Now, I didn't know what bipolar disorder was. So to me, what it looked like is these sudden angry outbursts over nothing, right? So I tell the story, if I handed him the wrong fork, right, as though I had a lot of different forks, right?
Right.
And he would flip out, for hours, the intensity and the duration of his episodes, I would call them, of anger. But I didn't know that was a symptom. I just thought he was, no offense, but just being really difficult. Oh, he's my difficult son, right? And he was having a tantrum. And my husband would come home and say, well, it's because you spoil him. Well, right? Or someone else would say, well, you should just give him the right fork, right? But yeah, I didn't recognize that the increasing outburst of anger and irritability was triggered from the SSRI, and that's how his bipolar disorder started to manifest. So
yes, the SSRIs, the Zoloft, Prozac, they're given to kids all the time. The first line of defense in anything mental health related with children is Prozac, Zoloft, Concerta, and Vyvanse,
right?
Which are the Concerta is the Ritalin, the long acting, and the Vyvanse is the long acting Adderall. And when kids who have bipolar disorder take those medications, things go off the rails the way you've described. Right. And normally what happens is the psychiatrist will say, oh, well, the Prozac and the Concerta didn't work, so we're going to switch them to Zoloft and Vyvanse. But the real message there is you're treating the wrong disorder.
Right.
And treating bipolar disorder needs to be treated differently, because what you do when you give them those medications is you trigger what's called a mixed state. And that mixed state is the sadness that goes along with the depression and the energy that goes along with mania.
Right.
And that is a very dangerous combination.
Yeah. There's some questions about how many children are there? Would you guess? I can tell you that 1 in 5 kids in our country struggle with a diagnosable mental health disorder, but that's not bipolar specific. That's still like 18 million children. How many children, and when I say children, 18 and under or ish,
Yeah.
are we talking about who struggle with bipolar disorder? And have there been studies? Someone asked about the incidence of suicide in that cohort, completed or attempted. And again, I can tell you that when it comes to general mental health disorders, suicide is the second leading cause of death from ages 10 to 24 years old, behind accidents. So suicide is a real huge problem for our children. I don't know, and maybe you could answer this, how many of those may have had bipolar disorder versus depression or other mental health disorders. But maybe you could speak a little bit to the incidence and the severity and of specifically of bipolar disorder and or the fear of the heart subtype, which we'll get to in a second.
Right. So we know that bipolar disorder is severely underdiagnosed. So the statistics on how many kids under 18 have bipolar disorder are significantly reduced from reality. So
and how do you know that? I'm pushing back a little because I know I get
right.
a lot.
We know that because we go through the process with families over and over and over again of 10 years of misdiagnoses before they suddenly magically turn 18. And the day that they were 17 and 364 days old, they had ADHD and DMDD, and then magically they turn 18 and they suddenly have bipolar disorder. So we see it over and over and over again.
I mean, I'm not surprised by it, but I know there's this idea out there that we are actually overdiagnosing every kid. I don't subscribe to that philosophy. I believe that yes, there's more incidence of mental health disorders because our world is more complicated. But I also think when I was a child, we just didn't diagnose these things at all.
No, we didn't. And we didn't know what they were. We didn't understand them. And there was stigma.
The bad kids, right? The druggies, the ones who quit school or ended up in juvenile, we just didn't talk about them enough to know. That's my personal philosophy. But so I'm interrupting you. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. I mean, I agree with you. Early intervention is the best way to have a positive long-term outcome. And so my attitude is with any disorder, correct?
Any health condition. Right.
So yes. So my philosophy is overdiagnosis isn't a thing. We are missing so many kids. There are so many kids falling through the cracks who are being labeled as the bad kid, the disruptive kid, the kid no teacher wants to have in their class. And we're not looking at what's causing those behaviors. Right. We're blaming the child.
Or the parents.
We're assuming willful choice with behaviors instead of allowing for the possibility that these things are symptom driven. And so, no, I don't think that children are being overdiagnosed. I think they're being underdiagnosed.
Someone made a point, Dawn, thank you very much, that it does take an average of 10 years from the onset of symptoms to an accurate diagnosis. We were really super lucky, yay, and it only took 8 years. 8 years of the wrong diagnosis and the wrong treatment as a result, while my son's condition just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And so I agree with everything you're saying. And for me, my son never acted out in public, only at home. never acted out in school. And so a lot of it was parent blame and shame, and which we
Yeah.
talk a lot about at the Youth Mental Health Project, is how much we feel that our child's behaviors are things we should be able to teach them how to control. And again, we don't understand that behaviors in children are actually, can be warning signs of mental health struggles, whether it's bipolar disorder or something else. And so without understanding that emotions, thoughts, and feelings fuel behaviors, which are then symptoms of potential mental health disorders, if we don't keep that conversation open, then we don't know to even think about that.
Well, and to speak to your point, mental health and mental illness go hand in hand, just the way physical health and physical illness go hand in hand. And you would never expect your child to go through childhood never catching a cold. They have bouts of physical illness and then a return to a physical stability. The same thing is true with mental health. They will have periods of mental stability and they will have periods of mental illness. And
I mean, that's what we
accepting
talk
that.
about at the Youth Mental Health Project. Our whole educational curriculum is based on the fact that mental health lies on a continuum. It's not about illness or wellness, that it ebbs and flows and fluctuates on any given day or any given period of time, just like our physical health. And for those of you listening who are interested in reading more and learning more about that, we have free materials on our website, fact sheets and booklets that kind of dive into what does that mean, mental health lies on a continuum. I think we've done a webinar about that as well, but you're absolutely right. That is something really important. I think that all parents need to keep in mind, regardless of the diagnosis.
But I'd like to get back to be able to answer your question about suicide.
Yes.
Because that's incredibly important.
There's so many great questions coming up. I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah.
So we believe that the bipolar disorder diagnosis is severely underdiagnosed in children. Right. That said, there are close to 1 million children in the United States alone who are diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Diagnosed, correct. We estimate, the World Health Organization estimates that there are 176 million people in the world with bipolar disorder. And bipolar disorder has the highest rate of attempted suicide. Yeah. More than 50% of people diagnosed with bipolar attempt suicide, and they have a very, very high completion rate of 15%. And so it is very, while suicide is a concern with all mental illnesses, it is of particular concern with bipolar because of that mixed state that I talked about earlier, where they have the sort of lows of the depression combined with the high energy levels of the mania. And that is the period in which those suicide attempts often take place. Yeah. So treatment is very much for bipolar disorder about saving lives.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. As a mother of a son who has bipolar disorder, it's a fear I live with every day. He was suicidal by the time he was 9, and it's just a heartbreaking, petrifying thing for parents to even think about. But it is something I live with every day, and I'm seeing a lot of people commenting in the chats about that. Also, it is, yeah. Oh, that's a great question. If these statistics are true, why do we have to fight so hard? And I think again, a whole webinar and workshop on the stigma, the blame, the shame, and how we can get beyond that is literally the mission of the Youth Mental Health Project and all the work we do at the Youth Mental Health Project. And I know for the Juvenile Bipolar Research Foundation, JBRF as well, we are trying to educate. Knowledge is power. The more people know, the more people understand about children and these disorders, the more they're willing to talk about it instead of hide from it, the better chance we are of increasing the availability of services and knowledge. So when my child was struggling, the school, and I needed help from the school, I had to teach them I had to learn and then teach them what bipolar disorder looked like for my child and how it impacted his education. And so that's why we do these webinars. That's why we have Elizabeth here today, is to engage in this conversation and to share the knowledge. So with that being said, and there are tons of questions, I do want to make sure that we get to fear of harm, because
Yes.
we could talk about, there's, again, maybe we'll just have to have a follow-up and answer more detailed questions about, you know, parent blaming and marriages and medications. I mean, this is a very big issue, but I do want to get to the fear of harm. I think it's called a phenotype, how it was discovered, what is it, what, you know, if you could get to that.
And I can go through that part of it pretty quickly. So back in the early 2000s, our research director, who wrote the book The Bipolar Child, which many parents use as a guide, he was doing a study specifically on identifying various characteristics of bipolar disorder in children. And so we did a genetic study on over 6,000 children diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And when they were analyzing the data and the symptom patterns, they noticed that there was basically a new symptom cluster emerging. And it was different from any other diagnosis that has ever been discovered, because it was centered around a physical symptom.
Oh.
And that physical symptom is temperature dysregulation. It's a body's inability to regulate its temperature properly. So it manifests in a lot of different ways, none of which we've been taught to look for in association with a mental illness. And so parents often come to me, and it's not until after I mention that they say, oh, wait, my kid has always had bright red cheeks and red ears and sweating when it's not hot out, and won't wear warm clothes in the wintertime when it's cold.
Oh,
and
my son would never put a coat on, ever.
Yeah.
So when you say temperature dysregulation, you don't mean they have fevers all the time.
No, I mean that their body literally cannot modulate the appropriate temperature based on the environmental temperature. So they are, and we actually measure it as a disruption in the ratio between their core body temperature and their peripheral body temperature, because what happens is our bodies generate heat throughout the day to keep us warm, to make us able to get up and, you know, walk down the street. And what happens is we expel that heat. That's what happens normally. With folks who have fear of harm, their body doesn't expel the heat. It keeps it trapped inside the core. And so they overheat. And this is associated with all sorts of behavioral symptoms. So irritability, defensive aggression, hypervigilance, exaggerated fears, verbal aggression, physical aggression. All of these symptoms are actually associated with the temperature dysregulation with fear of harm, because the part of the brain that controls temperature regulation also controls the fight or flight response. And so what we find is that when the temperature system is out of whack, it messes up the fight or flight response. So when you hand your child the wrong fork, he's experiencing that as an existential threat that requires an enormous response in order to protect himself and to save himself. And you're thinking, it's just the wrong fork. But to him, it is being interpreted and filtered through his brain as a danger that he needs to protect himself from. And so it's very, very hard. These kids who have fear of harm are labeled as irrational, as intractable, and they can't be worked with because they won't meet you halfway. And it's because you wouldn't meet someone halfway either if you were being chased by a bear.
Right.
Like, you just wouldn't. And their emotional experience is, I'm being chased by a bear. and I'm going to do anything I need to save myself.
So let me ask you a question, because can you have all the symptoms we talked about before of juvenile bipolar disorder and not the temperature dysregulation and not,
Yes.
so the fear of harm phenotype, which is I guess a subtype in layman's terms,
Right.
of bipolar disorder, that it's called fear of harm, but it's about temperature regulation. But is it also because there's fear of harm, like?
Yeah, it might be easier if we pull up the diagnostic criteria so that we can look at it.
You have the slideshow to share. That would be great.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and do that.
Just because I thought, oh, well, is it just about fear? But it's this temperature dysregulation that makes this particular subtype different.
Yeah. So
Thermoregulatory disturbance, right? Okay.
Yeah. So with the DSM, back to flaws in the DSM, in order to have a diagnosis, they say, like, here are 10 symptoms and you have to have 5 of them over a course of, however, 2 weeks.
2 weeks or whatever, right?
For fear of harm, you have to have all of these. And if you don't have all of them, you don't have fear of harm. So it's much more. You could have
bipolar disorder, you just wouldn't have fear of harm. Okay.
Correct. And our estimates are that a minimum of 1/3 of all people with fear of harm, with bipolar disorder, have fear of harm. And we take that from our study that had close to 7,000 people in it, that 1/3 of them had all of the symptoms of fear of harm in addition to bipolar.
And 1/3. I want you to stay tuned, because there's a reason that this is important in terms of treatment, which we'll get to. But let's talk about this first, and then we'll get to why it matters. Okay.
So 1/3 had all of the criteria for fear of harm. 1/3 had many, if not most, and 1/3 had none. So at minimum, 250,000 children in the United States have this disorder and don't know it. Okay. Could be as many as 500,000. And that's just of the ones who are already diagnosed with bipolar. The numbers of people who haven't even sought any kind of treatment yet could be much higher. But this is important, that you have to have all of them, because it significantly reduces the likelihood that you're going to be misdiagnosed. Mm-hmm. And it also involves the fact that there is an objective, observable non-behavior, but a physical symptom. So I'll go through them one by one. The first criteria, episodic and abrupt transitions in mood states, that is where you see all of the traditional bipolar disorder symptoms. Mm-hmm. They all sort of get lumped together in that symptom. And we can look at it here. Rapid alterations in levels of arousal. And what that means in layman's terms is that they are jumping from one mood to another quickly and without warning. They are excited one moment, furious the next, and then feeling, terrible and self-loathing. I mean, it just all over the map. Emotional excitability, sensory sensitivities, which are often, they get the sensory sensitivity diagnosis, but it could also be a part of this, and the manic or hypomanic mixed states. So this is basically saying, criteria A, you have the bipolar disorder symptoms. If this is all you have, then you're part of that 1/3 of people who only have bipolar disorder, and those are treatments that are based on those symptoms. Right. And with fear of harm, when we treat it, this has to be done first. Mood stability to some degree has to be achieved before we can move on to the next steps. The second criteria is this criteria from where it gets its name, fear of harm. This is an intense fear that harm is going to come to yourself or to someone that you love. Mm-hmm. There's a easily misperception of neutral things as threatening, like I'm giving you the wrong fork, like I've asked you to put socks and shoes on, like I've said, hurry up, we have to get out of here, we're late, you're making us late.
Can that look like anxiety also, like just being so anxious?
Well, yes, and because this is where we're seeing that triggering of the fight or flight response.
Right, right.
So you could get aggression with fight, you could get oppositional refusal to comply, and the kid, you know, runs off when you ask them to put their shoes on. That's the flight. Or you can get the freeze response, which is the fight, flight, freeze, where they just won't engage and they shut down. And that very often gets perceived as anxiety.
Right. Yeah.
Here we have obsessive bedtime rituals, fear of the dark, separation anxiety, hypervigilance, and reactive aggression to limit setting. This is where the no is totally intolerable, and there is no negotiation. No just sets off this perceived loss and threat that they have to defend against.
Right.
So then the third criteria is this thermoregulatory disturbance. And this is complex, but very, very easy to see most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's sweating when it's not hot out, red cheeks, bright red ears that are hot to the touch. Some parents describe it that their kid feels like a radiator. They get near them and they can just feel the heat coming off their skin. They don't have a problem being in cold temperatures without appropriate clothing. Their body temperature rises at night and drops in the morning, which is the reverse of what body temperatures are supposed to do. Right. They're supposed to go the other way. Our body cools down at night to prepare for sleep, and warms up in the morning to prepare to start our day. And this is, as I said, not something that we're taught to look for. And so most parents don't make the connection until we actually say, and by the way, does he sweat through his pajamas at night while he's sleeping? And they say, yes, no one told me to look for that.
Right, right.
The next criteria is aggression,
which we've talked about, right?
We've talked about verbal and physical. Some parents say, but they don't throw things or break things or punch things,
right?
But they're verbally aggressive, and that can be controlling too. That can be, that doesn't have to just be cursing, although it can be. And then the sleep-wake disturbances, this is another physical component of it, that there's excessively restless sleep. You cannot fall asleep at night, cannot wind down for sleep, cannot wake up efficiently in the morning. They have nightmares and night terrors that are horrific and vivid. They experience sleep paralysis, often sleepwalking, sleep talking, bedwetting, and bruxism, which is teeth grinding.
Ooh, yeah.
And so this is tied to the thermoregulatory disturbance because our body temperature and our sleep-wake cycles are linked biologically. Then we have to rule out that it's not caused by a general medical condition. As you said, it's not that they're getting fevers every time they get sick. It's that chronically, every day, rhythmically, they are overheating.
Right. And then some sort of family history.
And some sort of family history. This is the only criteria that's not required. And that's because it's not about the child, him or herself.
So I learned at one point that there were studies to show that bipolar disorder is actually one of the most genetic diseases on the planet. It's about 80% genetic. And I had no idea that we had bipolar disorder in our family. And I would have told you we had no mental illness or mental health conditions in our family. We just had some, alcohol addicts, right? Like I had, the drunk Uncle Jack, right? But no one talked about that back in the day. And in doing my own research and family research, what I found was there was a lot of undiagnosed mental health disorders that were just chalked up to the black sheep of the family kind of scenarios.
Right.
So I'm glad you put alcoholism and addiction in there as that.
Yeah.
And I don't want to rush this, but I see that we're getting close to the top of the hour. And so I do want to make sure we get to your talking about some of the treatments.
Yeah, that's what I was going to do next.
There are also some amazing questions that we haven't gotten into, and I really feel like we need a part 2 on
Fine
all
with
of the
me.
great questions. So for those of you who could stay on a few minutes, we might talk a little bit more. And I'm sorry that I haven't gotten to all of your questions because they're just great questions in there. But I do want to, Elizabeth, let you, sort of, tie up a little bit more about the fear of harm and what can be done and how do you die? What's the treatment?
So the treatment for fear of harm is different from that of other bipolar disorders because it has this physical symptom. And so if we go back and look at this is what we treat second. The first thing we do is we get that mood disorder under control, and the gold standard for treating bipolar disorder is lithium. It's very safe. It has a bad rap. People hear lithium and they think one flew over the cuckoo's nest, but that's really not the case. Lithium is extremely safe. It's been around and studied for a very, very long time, and provided it's prescribed to be titrated, to start slowly at a low dose, go up very slowly over an extended period of time with regular blood work and monitoring and getting enough electrolytes. We really don't see that there are a lot of problems associated with it.
Not to scare people, because when my son took lithium, it was the first time I saw a light at the end of the tunnel. It's the first time I felt like I was getting my son back. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, his body reacted very poorly and he became toxic, which was fine. We took him off lithium and he got better. And so if you're one of those people who can't take lithium, and I know that there have been a lot of research studying on ketamine, and one of the questions in the chat is about ketamine. Is ketamine a substitute? Are there other things that are substitutes?
Ketamine is not a substitute for lithium. Ketamine treats the thermoregulatory disturbance.
Oh, okay. So it's not a mood.
No, it is not. In fact, ketamine is very effective at addressing treatment-resistant depression,
right?
PTSD, but ketamine can be activating, which means that with bipolar disorder, ketamine can trigger mania, which is why we say that this symptom, the mood disorder symptoms, have to be treated first. Because if you introduce ketamine without mood stabilization, you run the risk of triggering mania.
Sorry.
No, go ahead. I was going to say, once this is done, once you have some mood stability in place, then we treat the thermodysregulation with ketamine, and that then resolves all of the other symptoms.
Right.
The regulation of temperature takes away the fear, takes away the nightmares, takes away the sleep disturbances, takes away the aggression. And so it's a sequential treatment. First, you get the mood stabilized, then you introduce the ketamine. And we recommend that the ketamine be intranasal, like a Flonase nasal spray, or a sublingual. It's just a little tablet that melts under your tongue.
Right. It's interesting you say that, because I would say, in my experience and anecdotally from the thousands of parents I am in communication with, that if your child does have a mood disorder, but perhaps also other comorbid, as they call them, or co-occurring disorders, to get the mood stabilized is the first thing to concentrate on. And meaning some sort of mood stabilization medication. And then you can start looking at the anxiety, the ADD, the other symptoms that the doctor may feel need other medications. And I feel like a lot of doctors do it the opposite way. They throw ADD medicine and then sleep medicine and weight loss medicine and stuff for depression. And you can't get to the moods because all of these other medications are disrupting the mood even further. And so my experience is the more you try to stabilize the mood and you just concentrate on that first, whether it's the fear of harm subtype or not, that should be the first thing you do. Right. So, and in fact, there are questions about blood work, and are there other meds that don't require blood work? That's a tough one.
Yeah. So I just want to put out the disclaimer that I'm not a medical doctor.
Yes.
So,
right.
What I can do though is I can share with you what our research team recommends. And our research team recommends that for bipolar disorder, the first medication that you try is lithium. And as Randy said, some people do have negative responses to it. Mm-hmm. However, if it is prescribed correctly, it reduces the likelihood of that happening. It doesn't eliminate it, but it reduces the likelihood, because you start at a very, very, very low dose and you go up very, very slowly, and you monitor how the kid's doing, and you look out for any potential side effects, and you keep them hydrated, and you keep them, having enough electrolytes, and you do the blood work. And when you do that, unless there is some sort of predisposition to not being able to tolerate the medication, we do see success. Parents, their number one concern with lithium tends to be the blood work. They're afraid of how they're going to get their kid to comply. Right. With fear of harm, it's even worse, because all of those kids have needle phobias.
Yes.
And parents have horror stories of having to hold their child down in the lab to get the blood work done. And unfortunately, sometimes it's a necessary evil. And I will tell you, from all of the families that I've worked with, once the child gets stable, they don't mind the blood work anymore. It's not a problem.
That's actually true. I just want to tell everyone, I'm going to stop sharing the screen because I want to see this. But if you want to take a picture of this, we will also put information in the chat about links for the different. Wait, did I do that right? Or maybe you need to stop sharing.
No, I'm going to stop sharing.
I think you have to do it. There are just so many great questions. But my son was petrified of needles. Petrified. And after the first couple of times, it took some work to convince him. Actually, I think what happened was they found a patch. There was a lidocaine patch, which they put on his arm to numb his arm. And then once he realized, oh wait, that didn't really hurt that badly, then it got easier and easier and easier. So
there's even an over-the-counter cream that you can just rub on.
Right. So lots of parenting tricks. And there are a lot of questions I am so sorry that we didn't get to, such as, how do we convince the doctor that it's a legitimate illness if it's not in the DSM? That's a great question. What might this look like as a child gets older? As a parent, how can we talk to our kids to help them understand their disorder? There's just so many great questions. Has there been any research on whether this fear of harm phenotype is in adults?
Yes, it is. I can actually do some really quick answers to those questions.
Answer some of those quickly, but I do think we need a part 2. That's what I think. Yes.
And that's great. It's a great idea.
See what you can come up with in a quick period of time. That would be great.
So yes, fear of harm exists in adults. We estimate roughly 2 million adults in the United States. You don't grow out of it. There's no cure for it. So it's heritable. So if you have it, you have it. So adults do have it. There's a lot of research that we've done into differentiating bipolar disorder in children from other diagnoses like ADHD. If you go to our website, which is just jbrf.org, go to our research page, you can find research that will explain that.
Great website. Yeah.
The other thing is that how do you convince your doctors? You call us, because part of what we do is advocacy. And so we have a program that is entirely free for families to participate in, which is if your child has fear of harm, what we do is we partner with you and we go in and we teach your psychiatrist, your therapist, your school counselor, your teacher, your occupational therapist, whoever it is who's on your child's team. We go in and we teach them what it is, how to identify it, how to diagnose it, and how to treat it. And we support you through that process. So if you need help with that, go to our website,
Right.
go to our contact page, send us an email, and we'll start partnering with you immediately.
Also, don't forget, there is a great questionnaire on your website. Some parents ask, well, how, is there a way we can figure out whether this is, our child has this or not? And you do still have that questionnaire on your website, right?
We do. It's not ours, actually.
Oh.
So Dr. Dmdd Popoulos, who wrote The Bipolar Child, I do that because it's on my bookshelf. And he's our research director. He developed these two tools, which they're just surveys that you take. The unique thing about one of them is it's the only survey to detect bipolar disorder that was designed for children to take. It's just cartoons that they can look at and identify whether or not they feel that way. And so we do have a link to it from our website. It's in the parents section. You just scroll down and you can click to it. It will take you away from the JBRF site to Dr. Popoulos's site, where you can take the measures and pay him a small fee for scoring. But that is a good thing. And we have little packets that we put together so that you can take to your psychiatrist the right research articles and the right materials, and a cover letter from us saying, hey, let's talk.
All right, that's great. I see some yes for part 2. I think we should definitely put part 2 together to dive into a little bit more about parents and what parents can do in all the different realms. It's so great to get more information. I've followed JBRF for a very long time, and I'm so glad to talk to you, Elizabeth. I want to let everybody know there's also information that's free on the Youth Mental Health Project website. Although we are not specific to juvenile bipolar disorder, we do have a lot of families that come to us also who have or just different concerns about their children's mental health. And our mission is to educate, empower, and support families and communities to better understand and care for the mental health of our young people in general. So please follow us, join us for other webinars. And there are, as I said, educational materials just about youth mental health in general. We provide free confidential parent support sessions that are virtual, as does JBRF, if you wanted to more specifically focus on the juvenile bipolar disorder fear of harm. We can never support each other enough as parents. I always say we get our best resources from each other. And you are a parent, I am a parent. We've been in this field as mental health advocates for a long time. You also as a mental health professional, there's still so much work to be done. So send me an email. I'm going to put actually my email address in the chat, as well as information.
Can I just answer that question that popped up?
Oh,
yes, of course. We're the Juvenile Bipolar Research Foundation, which means that you don't have to have fear of harm. You can reach out to us for anything. I also want to say that please don't be put off by the fact that our name has the word research in it. Most of what we do now is about taking that research and using it to the benefit of families. Most of our services are outfacing for families. Some have fees associated, most are free. We have support groups. We work with families all day, every day. So we're not just about doing research, we're about making that research work for you.
Right, and we are big fans. We are working on doing as many collaborations as possible because we have very similar missions. And So I just want to thank you so much for being here with us, Elizabeth. If you out there in the audience have other ideas for webinars that you'd like to see on our platform, whether it's about a child's mood disorder or not, please feel free to email me, shoot me ideas. If you'd like to be a panelist yourself and you have some special expertise to bring to the table, it is our mission to educate communities, to empower you with the knowledge that you need to support youth mental health. Our website and my email address is in the chat. Of course, we're easy to look up, and I'm assuming if you registered for this webinar that you are on our newsletter email list. Thank you very much. It will be recorded. We'll be sending out links, and you will be able to find copies of this recording on our YouTube channel. So thanks again, Elizabeth. It's such a pleasure. Let's definitely book part 2. And thank you all so much. What great response we had from the audience today. It was just fantastic. Anything you want to say in closing?
No, just remember you're not alone. This can be very, very isolating and very demoralizing. And no matter what you're going through, you're not the only one.
Yeah.
And we're here building a community to make sure that you don't have to go through this alone.
That's right. Elizabeth, I could talk to you all day. We just have to keep working together to spread the mission and awareness. And next time I want to talk about you moving to Hawaii to help your son with his thermatory, I'm not going to say it right.
Thermoregulatory.
Thank you. Dysregulation. So many great discussions. Thank you all. And thanks for joining us. And Elizabeth, I'll be talking to you soon.